Here we go. That's better. I'm going to move to just a few other things here. This is we talked about population and we got into some ideas about Thomas Malthus and maybe even Neo-Malthusian Paul Ehrlich, and then some alternative approaches to that with Julian Simon. Did we talk about Julian Simon yet? And the cornucopian approach to things? Well, anyway, this is just a ugly bar chart that displays the predicted population size, and you can, if you get onto the module on Canvas, you've seen the population clock. So what's the world population at right now?
7.8.
Yeah, we're at 7.7, 7.8. Yeah, so we're about to hit 7.8, and then the predicted, 8 billion is coming up pretty quick, just a few years. Maybe, actually, if you look at that population clock, it's a little bit slow, or at least, it's a little bit fast. The population clock will hit 8 billion people a little earlier than most predictions say 30, 40 years ago. It was anticipated that the 8 billion mark would not come along until a little more into the 2020s. But there's a lot of good news about population change, population growth, as I probably mentioned to you last time, and that is that everywhere in the world, population demographic change has taken a turn for the better. Okay, just about everywhere in the world, and unless you have some horrible political issue, namely war, you have improved conditions. And there are a few other exceptions, maybe. Up until just pretty recently, some populations had such high proportions of people with HIV and AIDS that it had actually kind of slowed population growth a little bit. And that's primarily in southern Africa, both the Republic of South Africa and surrounding neighboring states. But that is, in my lifetime, in the early 1980s when HIV was first discovered, essentially, or classified, and there was no way to cure it, of course, and then the other thing was that there was no way to track it. So those two things have changed with screenings of blood for blood transfusions, and of course, people understanding how it's transmitted. Most of the HIV and AIDS cases, however, occurred in the developing world, and they still are a problem in the developing world. In the developed world, at this point, we know that HIV is now termed a chronic disease that's manageable, which is, that's one of those miracles of if you're over 40 or 50, then it's one of those, miracles of medicine that you got to actually witness. At least I got to actually witness. Now, by the time you all were born, it wasn't such a huge issue in the developed world, but it was still a real problem in the developing world. But now HIV is on par with something like diabetes. It's a manageable disease. It's not serious anymore, but of course it is not something that is a death sentence like it was in, say, 1985. So that's great news. And that's just one good example of how some changes have taken place in the last 20 to 30 years around the world. Now, clearly, right now, the HIV management drug regimes that require dozens of pills or so. At least I don't know what it is now, but it's not anything that's cheap. However, the HIV management regime or protocols are now making their way into the developing world and becoming available, largely due to a lot of philanthropists like the Bill and whatever his wife's name Gates is. What?
Melinda.
Bill and Melinda Gates. Thanks. The Gates Foundation has done a lot to help expand that. So that's good stuff. That's really good news. Now, there have been a lot of other changes, a lot of other good things that have happened in the last 20 years. A lot of the parasitic diseases that used to plague folks in the tropical areas, particularly in tropical Africa, have largely come under control and are not so much an issue today. When my aunt and uncle lived, my aunt and uncle lived in Zambia for about 10 or 12 years, and my cousin is actually was born in South Africa, and she's adopted. But in Africa in the 1970s, 1980s, one of the worst things you would see among little kids were things like guinea worm. All right, you ever heard of guinea worm? Anybody? It's a parasitic disease that basically this big, massive parasitic worm would make its way underneath the skin and would grow and grow, and you could get rid of it, but you had to basically cut the skin and then like yank it out with a stick. But there are other things like bilharzia and schistosomiasis, African sleeping sickness, that are transmitted through things like snails. So back in the 70s and 80s, when my uncle and aunt lived in southern Africa, in a poor southern African country, even by African standards, sub-Saharan African standards, there were places where you could not touch the water. If you were wading in a creek or something, you did not want to go in the water. You certainly didn't want to drink it because it was infested with this blood fluke that would lead to schistosomiasis, this awful disease that would essentially be with you the rest of your life. And of course, you've heard of African sleeping sickness, maybe caused by spread by the tsetse fly, and affecting people who were nomadic herders, especially, and mostly in East Africa. That's still a problem. The tsetse fly is still kind of a problem, but the good news is a lot of the things that have changed the rates of mortality in the developing world have now become somewhat controlled. And the developing world is beginning to experience the health problems of the developed world, all right? So maybe you've heard of that distinction. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff, and I want to talk a little bit about graphics on populations and so forth. Before we go there, though, in what ways are mortality different in the developed world than the developing world or the industrializing world?
Older? So you mean
Help me out with that.
like people are older in the developed countries?
I couldn't really hear you, sorry.
The people are older
Okay.
when they die in the
Okay.
developed countries.
All right. People live to be, older in the developing. More people live to be older in the developed world, right? Okay. So, what's he getting at? The diseases that people die of tend to be diseases that really are associated with age and maybe diet and maybe lifestyle, amount of exercise that you get, and that sort of thing. Okay. What are those diseases? What's the number one killer in the United States?
Disease.
Heart disease. What else? Well, let's say number one. What are the top 4 or 5?
Alzheimer's.
Not really Alzheimer's, I don't think, at this point, but most people who have Alzheimer's don't die of Alzheimer's. Okay, I've learned this recently. What do most people, probably some of you have had grandparents or great-grandparents with Alzheimer's or dementia. How do they usually wind up dying?
Organ failure. They have organ failure. Their brain stops telling them their organs how to function and then shut down.
Yeah, maybe. How else? How else? A lot of them, a lot of people with dementia or Alzheimer's eventually die of pneumonia. Okay, and that's true with a lot of diseases. Okay, you can probably various. Why do they die of pneumonia? And it's all usually what we call foodborne pneumonia. It's not the type of pneumonia that you would develop after having a bad
Immune systems give up.
Yeah, I don't know so much the immune system, but what happens is you lose the ability to swallow. And my uncle, in fact, the uncle who lived in Zambia, passed away in April last year. And he had dementia, but it wasn't Alzheimer's. Not that it really mattered, but in his last few weeks, he completely lost the ability to swallow. So when you swallow a glass of your coffee or water or whatever that is, whiskey, when you're taking a swallow like that, it's actually a very complex set of muscle contractions, like a lot of muscles that are actually working, and it's all reflexive. We don't think much about it, right? I mean, you take a swig of water or something, but there's like a whole bunch of different things going on. And once Alzheimer's sets in, or dementia, you often lose your muscle control. You lose those motor skills within, or motor, the motor operations, I guess, within your neck, and so you don't have the ability to swallow. My uncle completely lost the ability to swallow, and so he was in a, well, they call it a memory unit, but basically it's a building that's locked so they can't escape, and that's about it. But he lost it totally. He just completely lost the ability to swallow. They would try to feed him at this place, and I'd go visit him, and he'd have like food from 3 or 4 hours earlier. It was just hanging there, and just it's pretty sad. But eventually, what happens is they aspirate it and breathe it in, and they breathe in bacteria from all the food, and pneumonia sets in, and they're gone. After a few days. So my stepfather has Alzheimer's, and we just did a swallow study with him recently, and so he has to, everything he drinks, water, whatever, tea, has to have a gel thickener in it to get a precise consistency that we've learned can go down. If it's too thick or if it's too thin. If it's too thin, he'll aspirate. If it's too thick, he'll choke on it. Okay, and so it's a fine line. Okay, so pneumonia, heart disease, stroke, cancer, all sorts of cancers, are the types of diseases that people in the rich countries like the United States tend to die of, right? They also die of suicides more often than people in the developing world, okay? A lot more often than people in the developing world, which tells us a little bit about some of the problems that we have, that's largely behavioral, I suppose, and mental health isn't any better. In fact, our mental health in the developed world is probably, you probably make a good argument that it's worse than for people in the developing world. You know, which I always found that kind of intriguing, you know, that people live, and people, some of the happiest people in the world, and they, you know, you've probably heard of the geography of happiness, you know, some of the very happiest people in the world live in some of the poorest countries, okay? And why is that? Well, a lot of it has to do, well, okay, I'll ask you this question. This is another thing that you'll see maybe online or on the Canvas course. There are these things that we call blue zones. Have you ever heard of those? A blue zone? Well, what's a red zone? Well, that's like 10 yards from the goal line, isn't it? Something like that. You know, a blue zone is this term that some demographers and geographers came up with to refer to a place that has an abnormally high life expectancy. In other words, the people in this place tend to outlive most other people around the world. Have you ever heard of places like that? Blue zones. There are actually quite a number of them, and there's been some recent research into these. You've heard of it, okay? So where's an example? Can you think of one? In the Mediterranean, yeah, exactly. In particular, Sardinia, all right? And what's the other island? Sardinia, and one's French, one's Italian. Anyway, I believe it's Sardinia. And so people on that island tend to have really high life expectancies. And it's not third world by any stretch, but it's not rich by European standards. It's actually kind of East Tennessee of Europe, you know. It's pretty backwoods for Europe. In other words, it's very traditional, very traditional. Other places include the home of karate. Where did karate begin? Okinawa, exactly. Okinawa, one of the Japanese islands, but one of the more tropical of the Japanese islands, okay? So Okinawa, another one actually, you know, what?
Costa Rica.
In Costa Rica?
Yeah, one of the highest life expectancies.
Really? Really? Okay, cool. There are a few others, but, you know, most of these places have some certain things in common. What do you suppose those things, what do you suppose some of those factors are that are connected with really long life expectancy? And by the way, even though there's a lot of long life expectancy, like this morning I got a call at 1:30, my aunt from the one that lived in Zambia, she's a widow now, they had to transport her to the emergency room. So I went to bed at about 11, got up at 1, and went to the emergency room and got back home at about 4 and went back to sleep and got up at 6. So if I fall asleep, you'll know why. But it's a typical problem. She's diabetic. She's 86, okay? She's a diabetic. She has beginning to have kidney failure, and with that you get congestive heart failure, which just means you get a lot of water on you, and it's pretty standard stuff. They'll give her some Lasix. You ever heard of Lasix? Some of you probably have. And, you know, it's a diuretic, and so it'll get rid of all the water, but then that's hard on her kidneys, so that's not going to be good in the long term. But this is a typical type of medical issue in our world. It's, a chronic issue that requires, sometimes ambulances and emergency rooms and, expensive medical care. She'll pull out of it, and she'll go back, and in probably a few more weeks, it'll happen again, okay? Until her heart gives out. And she's a wonderful person. But this is a real, this is the problem that we have. And so Alzheimer's or things like diabetes and congestive heart failure, yeah, we can live to be 90, 95, 100, but what's the quality of life like at that point, That's a difficult question. What you'll find in these places like Sardinia and Okinawa is that not only do people live long, their quality of life is really high. All right? So there's kind of a circular relationship there. They always, or their quality of life remains high as they get older. Now, in our society, and I'll say, in the United States specifically, it's pretty common. Not everybody's like this, but it's pretty common that your quality of life declines after what? 70 or so, right? 75. As your health starts breaking down, as your body starts getting older, we got lots of technology to keep you alive, but frequently the quality of life is pretty awful, especially if you get put into an assisted living situation. You're living by yourself maybe, or living in a way that you're not used to. So there's a quality of life issue. Now, what are some of those factors you think that are playing into increasing the quality of life for older people and leading to longer lives anyway? You probably know. Number one, in the United States, we'd probably say what? Diet, okay? You're not being exposed daily to Roundup, that's a bad one. And don't do like I used to do. I'll probably, who knows, I'll have cancer probably, but if you're using like a stripper or something on, like you're doing, oh, that sounded terrible. Like if you're refinishing some furniture, okay, and you're using that, that toluene, yeah, thanks. You're using that kind of stuff. Use a breathing apparatus. Don't breathe that stuff in. It's awful. It's bad stuff. Cancer causing. So we're exposed to all sorts of chemicals. We also eat lots of garbage that we shouldn't be eating. We don't eat nearly enough fiber. Those people in Okinawa and I guess Costa Rica and certainly in Sardinia, yeah, are eating lots of fiber. They're eating a lot of green leafy vegetables. They eat very little. These are the answers, folks. Okay, so you might want to write these down. They're eating very little processed food at all, and really not so much grain. Not like we eat a lot of grain. Like this morning, how many of you had cereal for breakfast? Well, how many of you had breakfast? Okay, not that breakfast is really. We've been told for decades and decades and decades that breakfast is the most important. Don't believe all that crap. Kellogg's and Pillsbury are the people that tell us that, and they're the ones who do the studies, right? So, but you can skip breakfast; that's no problem. But eating all that grain all the time, especially wheat, gluten, and stuff, a grain, high carbohydrate diet with little fiber and lots of sugar and lots of fat. Bad news. All right, and that's a real typical European style diet. But these places typically have lots of greens, lots of fiber, not a lot of carbs in terms of processed carbs, but they have a lot of whole grains and stuff. And when it comes to meat, they don't eat a lot of meat, but they eat a lot of seafood. Right? Lots of fish. Of course, fish oil is an important one, right? But more important than even diet, they get lots of exercise. So these are places that are not places where you have elevators, like the one I just rode to get up here. All right, I'll admit it. I took the elevator to go to the third floor. That's kind of lazy. Shouldn't have done that. But they're people who walk all the time. They don't drive very much because they live in places where their homes and their workplaces are pretty much close enough just to walk. Okay, small communities, lots of daily, low impact, low what do we call sort of low stress exercise. So these are not people who are training for marathons. By the way, if you train for a marathon, you're going to just tear your body to pieces. But especially if you're an old dude. Anyway, and then it's somewhat a matter of heredity. Anyway, I'm trying to get for have good diet. Oh yeah, one other thing in their diet besides lots of good fats, polyunsaturated fats. They're not getting most of their fat through hamburger grease. They're getting it through olive oils and nuts and good fats. They're limiting their amount of red meat to, anyway, a little bit of exercise every day, all day. So walking, just doing chores, that sort of thing. They drink a little bit of alcohol, all right? A little bit of alcohol every day, and just a little bit, okay? Not like 3 beers, but more like a glass of wine with dinner, right? Just, not even really for a buzz. It's just, it's just sort of like just a standard thing that people do. So a little bit of alcohol, a little bit of exercise constantly, good healthy diet, but that's a traditional healthy diet. But there's one more, and it's probably the most important one. What is it?
Drugs.
They're outside a lot?
Huh?
They're outside a lot?
I think that has a lot to do with it. I think you're right. Yeah, they are outside a lot. Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Did you say family bonds?
Exactly. Yeah, it's the fact that most of these societies, almost all of these societies live in, they're modern, but they're not ultra modern. And they're somewhat traditional in the sense that extended families are the rule. That's something that we've totally lost in this country, unfortunately, is the extended family. How else would there be a healthcare industry, that makes its money on the Fox News Channel? Because it's playing it's playing drug commercials all day long, and it's like people watch Fox News and drug commercials all day long. No, that's just a joke. But I mean, there is an industry associated with, assisted living, which, if you've been in it enough, a lot of them are assisted dying, all right, or just kind of babysitting because nobody has time for them. Okay, so it's a difficult issue. We live in a society where we're expected to work at least 40 hours a week, often 60 hours a week, and there's called 40 hours a week. But how in the world can you have a family? How can you care for young children when we have daycare, right? So we move them off to that. But when you get old, grandma and grandpa are really not expected to come live with you. And they don't expect to live with the kids. They don't expect to be taken care of necessarily. So that is probably the number one. I mean, if I were judging, it's a relationship thing. And the elders in these traditional extended family societies don't lose their status within the society. They gain status. The older you are, the more important you are, the more respected you are, the more people will do for you and help you and gain, so I guess I'm preaching to the choir now. I'm glad we can talk about that. If there is a way that we could ever get back to that in our society, I would hope we could try. This is something called the population pyramid. I've got a little video explaining what this is if you miss it. But essentially, this is the type of, well, first of all, we got to know what this is. This is a double histogram. The histogram just shows, the proportions of a particular cohort or category. And this is a double histogram basically showing the proportion of people in a particular age group in a population. So this would be the population of Nigeria in the year 2002. Total population in Nigeria in 2002 was 126.6 million. It's like twice that now, okay? And anyway, the projected population in 2025 was 204 million. But let's look at this. What you have here is a division in what we call another way of referring to this is an age-sex diagram, but somehow it's easier to remember as a population pyramid, right? And this one actually looks like a pyramid. The developed world, because of differences in birth rates, don't show or don't look like a pyramid, but this one does. So the developing world countries generally look like a pyramid. At least they did until fairly recently. On the right-hand side of the age-sex diagram or population pyramid are the female cohorts, the female population, and on the left, the male population. How can you remember that? Females on the right, males on the left. Females always right, okay? Women right, men not always right, all right? Anyway, okay, that's a married guy joke, okay? Anyway, this is the female population over here. Now, what you're looking at here is the percentage of the total population. So you don't really need to take it all the way out to like 30%, because there's not going to be a single age cohort between every 5 years. So this is 0 to 4, 5 to 9. So these are the age cohorts. The kids that are 4 years and younger in Nigeria and females made up 17% of the total population, and just about the very same over here on the males. So 17 and 17, 34, right? So we got 34% of the entire population, more than 1/3 of the total population, kids under 4, all right? See that? And so what does the age-sex pyramid tell us? It shows us what's, first of all, called the age structure, all right? Whenever you have an age structure that forms a pyramid on this, then the younger the population, the larger proportion, all right? And what does that tell us? Those of you that maybe have had, sociology 1113 or geography 1113 or some other course where you cover demographics, what type of birth rates would this society be having? What would they have really high birth rates or low birth rates or middle of the road?
High.
Very high.
We're having a population boom.
Very high population growth. In fact, we would say that the rate of population increase, or rate of natural increase in this case, that is the increase of population due to the addition of new births minus deaths, would be an explosively growing population. So rapid population growth. Now, rapid population growth doesn't necessarily look like rapid population growth. If you look at things like percentages, okay? The annual rate of natural increase in a population that has an exploding population growth rate would be like 3%. 3% per year. Okay, so you're adding 3% every year to the population. And that's births minus deaths. Okay, so a rate of 3% is very, very high. 3.2%, extremely high. Right? Well, what is slow growth then? Slow growth would be on the order of close to 0, 1%, okay, or less than 1%. And that's kind of where the United States is. Actually, the United States right now, if you just look at rates of natural increase, we have a negative rate of natural increase. And I'm afraid that that's going to continue to be the case into the future because folks your age have just nearly stopped having children, which is sad, okay? It's very, very sad. And it's not only sad, it might be difficult for the economy and difficult for the environment, okay? Anyway, that's a different story. So now, all I'm really saying is American young people are following the same trend as European young people did about 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Europeans, primarily East Europeans first and Russians, started having very low birth rates in the 70s and 80s even. And a little bit later in the 80s and the 90s, we saw really big drops in the rates of natural increase in the wealthy Western European countries like Italy and France. And you kind of think, okay, Italy and France, two Catholic countries, right? Roman Catholic countries, shouldn't, if they're listening to the Pope, or at least one of the popes, recently, not necessarily the newest one, but, if they were following the dictates of whatever the Catholic Church is putting out, if they were following that, right, wouldn't they have higher birth rates? Well, you can go to France and it's like one of the least religious countries in the world, all right? And Italy, not quite as non-religious. But this is a lifestyle decision on the part of younger people to not have so many children on average. In the United States, the average number of children that a woman will have in her lifetime, which we call the total fertility rate, or the TFR, the total fertility rate in the United States is now below 2.1. And that's an important number, 2.1 children per woman during her lifetime, okay? I'm going to ask the guys a question because I don't want to put the women on the spot. Guys, how many children do you intend your significant other, used to say wife, your significant other to have in her lifetime?
3.
3. Good for you. 0? Okay. Nobody else wants to answer? 2? Okay. I'll tell you what. We wanted to, but as I got older, I thought, man, we should have started earlier. We could have had 3 or 4 because they're a lot of fun, all right? And it's great to have kids. And anyway, I'm not Catholic and I'm not Mormon, so I'm not giving you religious stuff here. I'm just telling you, kids are a lot of fun, all right? And if you ever think you're never going to be ready to have kids, you won't ever be ready to have kids. Nobody's ever ready to have kids, especially the woman who has to give birth. But if you wait like I did, okay, 7 years after I'm married, we decided to have kids. It's like, well, that's way too late, all right? I waited so late that now, it's like my wife, she had our second child and she was in her 30s. And the doctor says, if you're going to have another one, you better hurry and have it because you don't want to have any after 35, right? Why do they tell you that? Right? You know why.
High risk,
High risk for
birth defects, schizophrenia.
Down syndrome, yeah. In fact, after, and other things, but, and not to mention dangerous, it's more dangerous to the woman, to the mother, but, there's the big thing is it's a high risk for Down syndrome. Well, okay, I can understand that. How many of you know somebody with Down syndrome? Aren't they a blessing? They're like the most wonderful people. Yeah, they're a lot of work and they don't live very long and it's sad, but that's just one of those things that we do in our society, right? We tell women not to have kids because we don't want any more kids with Down syndrome. The only people, anyway. Yeah, it's a tough one, but and it's difficult, but some of the people with Down syndrome are some of the neatest human beings I've ever known. Anyway, so this is the point here is that medical professionals will tell women in the developed world that getting past 35 is getting more risky. You probably don't want to have kids after that. So what do we do in our society? Everybody wants to have a career. I understand that. So women, particularly who want to have a career, are kind of forced, at least in the way things work in our economy, you're kind of forced to put that off or make a decision, right? And a lot of your generation have kind of decided career first, maybe children, maybe not children, and that's a difficult decision, and it's not fair. It's not at all fair. How do you reduce the population growth rate through natural increase? Well, you reduce the total fertility rate. That is, you reduce the total number of children a woman will have in her lifetime. And the way that generally has worked is through a couple of ways. One, by planning and government force, as in China, from about 1979 until about 2000 or whatever, when they quit really enforcing it, or 90s probably. And that was a real draconian approach to forcing your population to stop having children. Or in India was a socialist country for a long time. Real strong civil service government that directed population policies, often the population policies that were being spouted off by Westerners as things that they should do. And so things like forced and almost forced sterilization programs took place, where large numbers of people just were told, you're not going to have children. And so, this is one way. And then the other way is so that was sort of the coercive government planning way. And another one is the sort of organic market way. Market? What do you mean? Well, in our country, in Western Europe, you saw the same sort of thing. People have decided to put their career ahead of family, and so women will delay their first pregnancy, typically. Okay. Now, sometimes you plan to delay it, and bingo, something happened there. Okay, a little earlier than you thought. Okay, and by the way, those are blessings too. Okay, so anyway, frequently, if you put off having your first child until you're 24, 25, 26, then you think, okay, I'm too tired to have another child in 1 year after that. Okay, although my parents did it. I don't know how my mom did it, but you can imagine having like 3 and 4 screaming kids, 4 or 5, or 4, 3, 2, and a baby. It happens, but it's not very common anymore. So now we space them out. So and why do we space them out? Why do we space them out? Like, okay, we're going to have one, say, Susie Q has her first child at 25, and then she waits until maybe she's 28 for her second one. And then, maybe they want 3 kids, and then it's like 32 or 33 for the next one. And that's if everything goes well. Sometimes your body breaks down and you're not able to have any more. But spacing them out and starting them late, spacing them out is the way that the market, the free world, without government coercion, has reduced population growth rates. Now, I say without government coercion, but that's not really true, is it? Because here, even in the United States, the government may not coerce you. It may not forcibly sterilize you, or as in China in the 80s, force you to undergo an abortion against your will. Okay, a late-term abortion against your will. But they did. That's China. It's not a democracy. Okay, but they don't do that anymore. And so the point of that is, how has a country like the United States, or better yet, Germany, okay, how do they create incentives or disincentives for people to have babies?
They pay people to have children.
In the United States? In Germany, they do. Who do they pay in Germany to have children? Germans, okay? Not immigrants who are not residents, okay? You gotta be a German citizen. So, yeah, there's a nice incentive, monetary incentive, to have, how else? How about in France? Now, the French aren't gonna hand you out a lot of money to say, have more Frenchmen.
They give you, like, in France, they give tax breaks to families if you have like 2 or 3 kids, right? And then they give the mothers paid time off. Whenever
Yeah, it's like a year paid time off. Lots of social welfare benefits for babies and children. So there's a very strong civic sort of social welfare system that supports people having children. How about in the United States? Not so much. Here at OSU, we just instigated or I guess since, I don't know, the federal law and during the Clintons, but, now you have like a 12-week maternity leave, right? And that goes for dads now. Well, I was a little upset when I heard about that because I never got 12 weeks off for my kids, I used to bring them to class. I used to bring my kids to class and let them play. And man, you get good course evaluations when you bring your baby to class. Anyway, so that's about time to go. But there are a lot of incentives. And one thing I wanted to say was income tax. Okay, income tax deductions for dependents are incentives for certain people in the population, namely the people who are bringing in income, to have more children. On the other hand, we have examples of, folks who are maybe underemployed or unemployed, and since they're not going to be paying so many taxes, they're not going to have any of those incentives, right? So incentives and disincentives, and, I'll let you go. So have a great week this week. And see you